Hello everyone, today we talk about the 15th century Janissary appearance in terms of clothes, arms and armor. And I made at the very beginning of Schwerpunkt a very similar video to this one, so it's probably going to sound repetitive. This is mostly for our historical unit series. The other was mostly for the dress, right? That's what we concentrate somehow more on today, because as we have seen also in other videos that I already made about the Janissaries, that their equipment, their armament, as a matter of fact, was much more varied and unstandardized than actually their clothing, right? So that's an important thing. We will come back on the Janissaries in terms of organics, tactics, and more, right? So this is definitely not nor the first nor the last video on the topic. And for the 15th century in particular, because naturally we're much better documented about the first centuries of the modern age, but there was all an evolution in the first centuries of the Osmanian dynasty regarding this court that, as you know, was basically embodying the same sultanial power, right, personal power in many ways. So even the appearance of the Janissary had a lot to do with that representative need. Now, even for the least knowledgeable, it's notorious that the most recognizable feature of the Janissary was his hat, right? His headgear, which was not always the same, even throughout the 15th century. This headgear is commented on by just about every contemporary source, Western and Ottoman alike. You know that fundamentally we have, say, there is a disproportionate amount of foreign documentation on the Ottoman military as opposed to within the latter's empire as such, because there were lots of Westerners in the Ottoman Empire visiting for lots of different reasons, part of what we'll see now today. The local sort of Greek Byzantine literature was not excessively prolific in terms of more technical information, or properly the Turkish one. In any case, we get, as you'll understand now from the evidence, a substantial amount of information on the so-called akberk. This was the term used by the Turks to call the hat, while in the Latin sources we find the term mitra or pilos. Right. Now, the interesting thing, as we'll see now about this headgear, is that it had conceptual in common, even in the etymology of the terms that were used to define it, the ancient idea of an armored headgear, as a matter of fact. Ducas, that is a Byzantine Greek historian that flourished under Constantine XI, Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor, thus making the source one of the most important for the last decades, the eventual fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, tells us that in the common language of the Romans, that here means the in vulgar Greek basically, this Ottoman headgear was, and Janissary headgear specifically, was known as the zerkula or zarkula. Right, we've seen it just the other day in that video about Byzantine warfare, about the terminology employed, but also the actual designs that were circulating. Apparently, even we do not understand, but before the rise of the Ottomans, right? And so, of course, had not been invented by them just per se. And Zarkula, all the entire, say, the characters all attached, is actually the Greek corruption of zirkulach, which means essentially a male coif, right? This later characterized by a shallow dish covering the top of the head as well, right? And so, in other words, this is a sort of male hood or helmet that obviously is not what we know as the Janissary headgear that was made of cloth, but that perhaps was worn beneath it, right? And so this is the actual connection with the originally armored sort of idea of course, of these were top soldiers in many ways. A helmet is the first thing you may want to wear, even if you are a poor soldier of some sort, and especially at this point, right? In spite of the fact that Ottoman equipment was on average lighter, say, than the Western one, of course, there was an important level of armoredness, especially the 15th century, as you know, is the peak of armoredness in, say, of human armoredness, let's put it in this way, in warfare. Right. Now, if you look at the Turkish Akbök, this looks even a bit like in concept, developmentally, as the Phrygian cap or Phrygium, which is somehow ironic, yet random, because Phrygia was exactly the same area, right, from which the, say, of the name, the classical name of the same area, from which the same Osmanian dynasty would emerge. Right, and from which that design, in fact, would spread even historically among pretty far away. Right, there is not necessarily a connection to the ancient root, but it's meaningful. As for the Latin terminology, mitra in Latin, the mitre of the bishop, basically, was a term deriving actually from the same Greek. We find it in the Iliad, for example, and it defined an actual helmet, right? Achilles himself, if I'm not wrong, was wearing it. The same goes for pileus, which is also coming from pilos, that, as you know, was even properly a type of helmet, especially during the Peloponnesian War, so with this sort of oblong form, so recalling, in fact, this other type of headgears that were called as pilae in Latin, that were quite common. I mean, just if you look at the Anatolian, the Balkan world, there were somehow characteristic of broader areas of the Slavic. So it was a generic term, because that's what the Latin here is calling for a head that evidently was called by the Turks in a more specific way. But it's that makes sense, because it was not just a helmet, but also this close-fitting brimless headgear that the ancient Romans had adopted from the Greek sailors, by the way. The Turks in the 14th century were pretty much pirates in the Aegean, aside from their terrestrial raids. So this is just a cultural note, but you understand how things repeat themselves in terms of designs, names, functions, historically, and it's a very simple material culture, of course, compared to our own. So this originally surely had to do with some level of armoredness. We will talk about arms and armor later, because essentially, aside from, in fact, the most typical sort of iconic Janissary appearance, we have definitely an important level of armoredness, even though many of the arms and armor that sometimes are showed in museums saying, this is a Janissary thing, actually doesn't necessarily mean that it was, right? But the Janissaries were tactically complete, right? And they would equip themselves in very customized way, also from campaign to campaign individually, aside from the, say, normal patterns of what kind of troops were they employed, like for broader strategical, tactical reasons. Now, the Saint Ducas describes the Janissary head as, quote, made of the whitest felt, cylindrical in shape, snugly fitting the head, that is, in a way that is tight or close fitting securely, rather than also comfortably, likely, as these things were mixed for practical purpose. Say, being as much as a span above the crown and tapering to a point. Right, and this description fits perfectly. Perhaps the most famous as detailed representation of a Janissary dress, that is the one realized, for the 15th century, but also generally representatively, in 1479 in Constantinople by the Venetian painter Gentile Bellini. That was portraying what was possibly a Solak guardsman, right? A Solak, the name of part of the Sultan's bodyguard in the old Ottoman military organization. So as we will understand later, we're not actually sure about the degree of uniformation of the Janissary dress, right? It would have not been strange to change factually. The hat seems to have been the most standard thing in shape and color. But let's say the color of the dress would have been surely changing at some point. At least they're represented in different colors for the few, however, sources that we have, right? As we will see later, also the same Mihailovich that had been a Janissary himself actually doesn't tell us, sadly enough, given that he had been there and was thoroughly describing the Ottoman army, thankfully instead, in other ways. And so we just don't know, right, for this period. The origin of the Janissary white hat predates, we are sure, the same establishment of the Janissaries. So it was an old one, and we can't quite trace the history of it. But prehistorically speaking, in the sense of, say, before we can actually track it, being that one would have been worn by the Janissaries, of course, in the region, this thing would have been fairly common to some degree, that, however, we can't properly measure in fact. There is another 15th century chronicler, that is Urwi. This wrote for the Ottoman history. The interesting thing is that he was basing himself on 14th century sources that we do not know, as it often happens historically. And he states that this particular white headgear had been adopted around the 40s of the 14th century on the suggestion of Orkan's brother. Orkan is the second bey of the Ottoman dynasty, right? His brother was Ali Pasha, who had essentially advised him to standardize this headgear to make essentially all the Osmanian army wear red hats, except for what were his dependent slaves, that is to say, properly the Sultan's own army, what would be known as the Kapukalki. I made a video a few years ago about the Kapukalki. So in Turkish, that is literally the gate or court people, and it was practically the Ottoman Sultan's own army of dependent household slaves, so originally composed of prisoners and mercenaries, Muslim and Christian alike, and of course having a lot to do with the establishment of the Janissaries as well, right? The Janissaries were considered de facto the Sultan's adoptive children, right? His own, right? As slaves, though. And so they literally were organized on the basis of household functions, right? They had this huge cauldron from which they collectively fed themselves, because they were thought to be literally even the cooks and other, servants, literally, of the Ottoman, of the Sultan's house as such. This was the very sort of patronizing, to say the least, mentality that within which you were put, right? A sort of superstition, a sort of, aside from all the privileges that at some point, especially over time, came, with it, right? But we all know about, I will see it better in another video, about the Ottoman, the Janissaries training, right? And sort of upbringing, etc. So this first distinction, right, of the white hat appears for the Kapukalki already, right? So just like the Janissaries, they would have been with a white hat, whereas all the others would have worn a red one, right? All the other Ottoman troops, right? So also freemen, technically, would have worn that. And this white was instead the privilege of the Sultan's slaves. And remember all the connection with the Mamluks, the idea that after all the servants were, at that point, actually more important than the same freemen because of their connection with the sovereign, etc. We are there, right? One of the single most overlooked thing is the Ottoman, let's say the influence that the Ottomans received from other people, the Mamluks, the Persians. Idris al-Bithlizi, that is was an Ottoman Kurdish religious scholar and administrator living the second half of the 15th and first half of the 16th century, tells us instead that the whole of Orkhan's army had been wearing white caps. So we're not sure here about the truth, of course. We know, however, that under Bayezid I, who had been an Ottoman Sultan from 1389 to 1402, he was ordained on the advice of Timurtash Bey that only the Sultan's own troops should wear white hats, whereas the others should have been wearing red. And this is yet a confirmation, at least of the first case. We should consider that the Karamanlids, that is to say, the Karamanli Turks, native of the region of Karaman in Anatolia, had been a power on their own before being taken over by the same Ottomans in the 15th century, were too recorded as wearing red caps in the 14th century. So this may have been as we've seen, a broader custom. I mean, after all, what's so strange about these late medieval armies starting to sort of uniforming their headgear, especially for very basic recognition purposes? This was happening pretty much everywhere. Now, all the sources at our disposal agree that the Adzabs and other Turkish soldiers, and so here, as Dukas says, both the commoners and the nobility, were, however, distinguished from a certain time on from the Janissaries by wearing red hats, right? And that was fundamentally to stay throughout this period. We have other late 15th century iconography depicting Janissaries bearing, instead of the more characteristic sleeve cap that we see especially in 16th century pictures. Here I inserted even some of them, so there is not an enormous difference, right? But still bear in mind, which would seem to confirm that what Dukas was talking about right now was clear, right? And the same Janissary depicted by Bellini was part of surely of a sultanial bodyguard. We also have famous iconographic depiction of the Battle of Zonchio, again between the Ottomans and the Venetians at sea, from a Persian manuscript of the 70s and the 80s of the 15th century that actually depict both types of sleeve caps. So obviously at some point they would have overlapped in a way or another. We have to understand, we will see it now, that the concept of uniformity extended more to the identifying color than the actual type of dress, right? Also because the soldiers were provided with the cloth, an already colored one, and then they would have had to have them tailored, and this in the latter phase would have entailed, in fact, an important degree of customization to some sort. It's also possible that at some point these two types of sleeve caps would have just come to distinguish different units. We just don't know that, right? And it's not all that important, telling the truth, because again, color was more important. And after all, even if these had been treated as uniforms, right, you know that on campaign that doesn't last very long, right? So there are other also political and social reasons why these people were given this uniformity, these uniforms, of course. And this is the point, right? The Janissaries, together with other elements of the Kapukhalki that were, in fact, two different things, were uniformed, right? So you would know through their appearance who they were, right, and what kind of unit they belonged to. The aforementioned Idris al-Bitlis's chronicle tells us that Janissary uniforms were first introduced under Bayezid I. So we are again at the end of the 14th, very beginning of the 15th century. The source says that various garments were chosen for Bayezid's army. The uniforms then introduced, according to Cantacuzene, is a Byzantine author, were of gold embroidered silk, which, say, likely, if it happened at any point, likely were in fact already for the guard, right? But it's possible still that there was this extended to the entire Janissary Corps at some point, right? This would last apparently until the 40s of the 15th century. At this point, the Pseudo-Sphrantzes, that is yet another Byzantine source, right after, say, named after the famous historian, imperial courtier living from 1401 to 1478. All right, so the Sphrantzes, just a minimal biographical note, was the attendant of Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos. He was Lord of the Imperial Wardrobe under John II Palaiologos, also a confidant of Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor. He was an eyewitness of, in fact, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. He was enslaved by the Ottomans, but ransomed shortly afterwards, because, of course, individuals of such rank were mostly treated well, even in prison, and they just cost very much, right? They had to be preserved, right? And Francis would eventually take monastic vows in 1472, and that's when he wrote his story, right? He died again around 1478, at least just after the attempt by Mehmed II to capture Naupactus. So we are in summer 1477, and we think he died shortly afterwards. And according to at least the Pseudo-Sphrantzes, Murad II changed uniforms once again, compared to these sort of at least stylish ones, at least if we have to believe Cantacuzenus. Now, we, as we were saying before, that we don't know what color the new uniform introduced by Murad II was. The only clue that we have regarding the color of the new uniform that Murad II issued comes from a later source, the Art de Porte, in Latin, of course, dating to 1473-81. This is essentially the Greek description of the gait and army of Sultan Mehmed II, right, at the time, right? So, notoriously, Murad died 2 years before Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, so obviously they are the same years in practice. And this source tells us that each Janissary received lengths of linen and blue cloth, right, plus a shirt and a bowline cap then, right? So that would have been blue. That's as far as we go, even though we can't be fully sure about that, right? Regarding the uniform at that point, we have the aforementioned source of Konstantin Mihailovich. That is a hell of a source, because this was the guy that basically joined. He was a Serbian soldier from Ostrovica, born in 1430, who wrote a memoir regarding his time in the Janissary Corps, right, in the Ottoman army, right. Ostrovica is near Ruznik in the Serbian Despotate, and the interesting fact about the source, it was written sometime around, say, between 1490 and 1501, is that it's really practically the unique source telling us what the Ottoman army was from the within, and particularly from a Janissary that naturally was a the core, right, of Ottoman military power. And by the way, the reason why Mihailovich, that had served in this force, but was writing the book, was actually to help Christian powers, saying, well, look, I was there, I can tell you how it is, so it will be easier to fight against them. And that speaks volumes, of course, about the, let's say, the different allegiance, the fact that this guy was fundamentally eventually signing with Christendom in this effort, but he had served there as well, and that again is not that strange in the same Europe. You have, say, Catholic and Protestants serving in each other's army, sometimes without too much of a problem, right? We're not mentioning literal mercenaries, or as we've seen with the Franco-Ottoman alliance, I made multiple videos on, so that's all pretty notorious history. But again, Mihailovich is quite unique in his kind. Well, he tells us that each Janissary received a kaftan, right, like in the previous source, a shirt, then large trousers made, as it's the Turkish fashion, of 3 ells of cloth. An ell was a former measure of length equivalent to 6 handbreadths, right? It was used, in fact, mostly for textiles. It varied, right? I think in Britain was something between around 40 inches, but it truly varied there also over time. So you see, they were given. It's not that few, right? You have also this other shirt of 8 ells. Mihailovich doesn't tell us again anything about the colors, and we can't simply guess that they did vary within the same Janissary corps because of simple reasons of esprit de corps, of organic, of sort of how unit differentiation. So of course it was something in common, just like the hat, for example, but the color could definitely change. And it may be the reason, after all, why Mihailovich, together with other sources, is not that telling about that, because likely that varied, and so it would have not been that important to tell it after all. We definitely have from different manuscript sources Janissaries in action, and we see, for example, they do not wear the kaftan, right, which could be tucked up, for example. Speaking of the tunics, we see different colors, again, not surprisingly. Blue, as the one was issued in the part, but also red and green. All colors that would have been used in and documented for the Ottoman army, but specifically the Janissary Corps in the 16th century. We're talking specifically of red trousers, undershirts in a variety of colors that surely had to do with, but perhaps not the absolute uniformity of the same units, say, clothes, but still varying on the basis of the same units, right? We are showed gilded rims for the Janissary circulars. Written sources also similarly described silver gilt for the rim. The Zonkya woodcut, one of the most important iconographic sources, shows Janissaries in red and green kaftans, right, that are, other than brown, actually the only colors that the artists in that specific source used. So this means there was a variety, but it can just be sticking to this colors choice for artistic purposes that we can't know specifically. Consider that the dressing code was particularly important at any ethnic, religious, civil, or military level, right? So especially in such a multicultural empire like the Ottoman one. We can say that in general Ottoman costume was based on Persian rather than Arab tradition. And also more, right? There was a considerable step influence from probably also the Turco-Mongolian side of the story. There were all kind of influences also from the West, etc. But as we've seen also in other videos, the ones about Ottoman cavalry, heavy and light, etc., there were all sort of, especially Eastern influences of some sort. The say in spite of the greater conflictuality with Persia, still that was one of the most obvious pools of, say, influence also on the Ottoman military to some degree, especially in the early days, but not all. Again, the step one was particularly strong. And the reason why the Janissary headgear was so important is that, like in all these other fields, it denoted rank more than any other item, say, of clothing. We have, for example, an early 15th century Burgundian visitor in the Ottoman Empire, the squire Bertrandon de la Brocquière, describing, in fact, early Ottoman costume. He says, 2 or 3 thin ankle-length cotton robes, one over the other. For a coat, they wear a felt robe called a kapina, he says. This would be the French for the Turkish kapanitse, which it is light and very waterproof. They wear knee-high boots and wide breeches into which they stuff all their robes so that they will not get in the way when they're fighting or traveling or busy. Consider also this large unknown, right? One thing is describing, say, a horse archer in combat, right? Or a soldier proper. The Janissaries at say the Ottoman military station, Constantinople, of course, would have been very differently looking from one of the provinces, would have been sort of more relaxed to some degree. Say some areas of the empire where these forces came from was also wilder. So it really depends, and unfortunately we do not quite have the clear-cut picture of all what we would like to know. As we were premising before, this particularly extends to to armament proper, because there wasn't quite a thing like, conceptually like a type of standardized armament. The Janissaries worked as a sort of core on their own, of course integrated with the others in the army, etc. And so, of course, as we'll see now, having some preferences given the logic, right, the tactics they had were formed. And they would select their own preferred weapons, right? The aforementioned Ordo Porta states that the Janissaries are armed to their liking, say to each own's liking, each one in fact taking whatever arms he sees, right? Because there were probably some warehouses where all these weapons could just be collected at the start of the campaign, or stored. These arsenals were known as the Cebbehane, if I pronounce it correctly. So consider that the Janissaries were not issued with heavy weapons in peacetime, right? So we get this impression, in fact, that they were light, because also these more famous representation of them were depicting them in a sort of peacetime context, right? Janissaries had also cavalry, by the way. This is notorious, actually, just as the fact that Janissaries wore full armor, especially during the early days, like these ones of the 15th, and siege assault squads continued to do so also in the following centuries. So that, as you know, armor never quite disappears from battlefields in a consistent manner until the 18th century, where, yes, there were still some heavy thing about the cuirassiers in the Western world, but let's say in general, right? And the sense is that the Ottomans, yes, were sort of more lightly equipped than the Westerners. Actually, the Janissaries are, in fact, they do not quite fight in pike and shot formation and tactics, right? The Ottomans really lack that, because the Ottoman society is really not the Western one. It cannot provide with substantial amount of pike and shot, like just their society is different. They will not have that concept of widespread uniformity. We were just talking about that the other day, with the influence of Protestant ethos into this sort of uniformation in Western Europe, right? It was actually a sense of subjection and sort of obedience to the assault, and so that actually did make an important collective discipline for the Ottomans that was recognized with awe by the Westerners, but it was not channeled into pike and shot warfare, rather some sort of assault infantry, right? So assault engineers, and sort of more flexible units, right? But they had all kinds of forces in a tactically complete way. We can also say that the majority of Janissaries was armed actually as light infantry, with bows prior to the introduction of handguns that still made them light infantry at that point. This is particularly relevant because even though the shot was actually, the Ottomans didn't have much pike and shot, but definitely they had a lot of shot in this more quasi, as we've seen here, customized, personalized way, right? Janissary firepower was impressive. There is a lot about from Western observers, and some of the most famous Ottoman sieges pointing out the existence of very advanced, essentially sniping shots, but let's say even there we shouldn't confuse that with the much more uniform development of shot and combined arm tactics that we find in the West, right? The Saint Janissaries in this sense were an elite, because the majority of Ottoman troops were lighter. So the fact that also the Janissaries came from an archer tradition, especially in the 14th century, well, that is still somehow typical, aside from their elite role. Even if some, in fact, elite archers could engage into hand-to-hand combat, considering what really, and we've seen it recently also again in those videos about Byzantine warfare, etc., what really 14th century Anatolia and the Balkans really were, right? In terms of, thanks to the same sort of push from these war bands coming also from Central Asia to thicken the ranks of the Osmanian dynasty, in terms of spreading horse archery especially. And so having this sort of more stable defensive but also offensive dependent situation, heavy archery, we could say, doesn't mean much, right? But the sense of being compact enough, especially from a disciplinary point of view, motivational point of view, and elite equipped with some possibility of taking on the enemy as well. If you look at, 15th century English archers, they still had, they already had also from actually previous century little hammers, swords, right? So this was somehow normal given the level of professionalization of warfare that had consistently occurring throughout the 15th, say in the late Middle Ages in general, so that those who fight are really heavier than they had been in the average as a typology of unit, right? That can take a stand, can offend horse archers, because the idea is also that the Ottomans are much more Western than we think, and so even against this typical sort of hordes of Turco-Mongolian but also Persian horse archers that pour continuously out from there, like think about even Timur the Lame, etc. Well, yes, archers will not stand actually their ground against a heavy cavalry charge, not even with palisades, because you always need a heavy infantry of sort to do that. But it's in fact the Janissaries do have that as well. But they will outshoot the horse archers, and this is actually a typically sedentary sort of Western, in this sense, anti-step function that in this particular context is carried out successfully still with archery. See, these areas had not developed much of crossbow capacity. They would actually have them. We know that, let's say, at least the Byzantine forces employed this weapon extensively. So we know actually a few about Ottoman crossbows, to be honest, but we see even just through Byzantine warfare that the degree also of westernization of arms and armor had reached the Turks. Right, so it wouldn't have not been that strange to see, I don't know, an Ottoman soldier at the siege of Constantinople actually fighting with some sort of looted Italian full plate armor. Right, so that would have been present, not typical, let's say, of course, even for the heavy infantry or cavalry, but right, there were these kind of things, and we tend to counterpose these things. But remember that again, the Ottomans emerged literally from a place it's just on the Marmara Sea, right? So it's just the same Roman land, same Byzantine land. We think, in fact, that the majority of Janissaries were actually equipped with bows till the end of this era. It is known that, of course, the Ottomans refined firepower, they introduced the granulation of the powder and all these very important innovations. They had very specific strategic, tactical, and operational reasons for developing, for example, those monstrous bombards, etc. But it doesn't mean that the shot was particularly widespread, however, among the infantry. The Janissaries being sort of the elite that were really sort of most updated in that regard. But it wasn't quite always, it isn't the case for the majority, right, of Ottoman forces. Each Janissary received 30 aspers, that is a former Turkish monetary unit, a silver coin worth like 1/120th of a piastre, annually for purchase of a bow and arrows. Right. Mihailovich, while describing the Janissaries, states that some are archers who shoot bows, some gunners who shoot mortars, others handguns, and still others crossbows. Right. This is important because also arquebuses, later muskets, were yet to become prevalent. There was a more primitive form of handguns, and again, that wasn't as common as you could see in in Western Europe, right? They had just at the beginning of this period become a substantial part of tactical quantities, right? So remember that the Ottomans, in this sense, would have also mastered gunpowder technology at some point. At some point, they were also resistant, telling the truth. It's not true that they were immediately open to that. It's always sort of, I talk about it in the video about Ottoman artillery and more. But again, the fact that you're particularly advanced in technology doesn't necessarily mean that you can simply apply that, right? You can't use it, you can't distribute it that much. So we can't think even of something, say for Janissaries, they would have had likely some of the finest equipment in the Ottoman Empire, but generally speaking, right, there would have been an important variety of equipment, and we do not know in this sense how many of them were issued what quantitatively. Here Mihailovich told us that. We know that the bow would remain a prestigious ceremonial weapon throughout the Ochak's history. We know that the Turkish word for crossbow, that is tsanra, came likely from the Byzantine zagra, unless both derived from the Persian Arabic yark for crossbow, so we do not know that necessarily, but it's evident that all these sort of even more Western looking things were in the air, right? And the fact that they weren't used is not much that naturally crossbows at this point were reaching quite advanced models. They would disappear eventually after the peak of the development of firearms, at least as a useful weapon in armies by the mid 16th century, right? But this doesn't mean that a crossbow couldn't be used or was that particularly difficult to build in this area. There was a reason why that was not the case. It had to do with the type of enemies, again with the society. With the sort of loser, again, it's easier to train at that. Just that there is some horse archer that is coming to raid that you can hire, etc. That can be simply cheaper in the East to train consistent bodies of crossbowmen, right? And in part, the Janissaries would have been that, except they maintain archery for some reason. It's a bit like the same concept of the English longbowman. The longbow has nothing specifically to do with England. In itself, it was used all over Europe. But in the peak of longbow armed, say, forces in the English armies that naturally were mostly reliant on the heavy infantry rather than light one, the rest of Europe was keeping the crossbow as the standard missile weapon, right? Italians literally produced the bows that were sent to England to be used in these armies, but they kept using crossbows for themselves. Yes, there were some, again, longbowmen were present all over Western Europe. You can argue here, even among the Turks, there were some, but that, after all, has to do just with the size of the guy and how you use it, for which particular reason, whether you can think of some doctrinal employment. If you look at Nicopolis or Varna, you realize that Turkish archery was a thing, and it was not used in a radically different way to stop cavalry than what the English did with the French to some extent, because it's really the same formula, right? It's not English or Turkish or whatever, it's just what you do with what you have, however, available. That's actually the most important thing. And so I forget the point I was making, except again, in fact, the fact that we shouldn't think there was any more specific reason why they would use a missile weapon more than another in a technical, deterministic way, right? They could have achieved the same results with firearms or crossbows, depending on the situation. Later, the Janissaries' enemies would be mostly caught by the enemy firepower. Right, they realized the Janissaries were increasing the use of firearms. They put the enemy under pressure, and even if they didn't have this great stopping infantry, still they were, heavy enough to. They were fierce assaulters. They carried out sort of, Stoßtruppen tactics, even when they had to. Given that they were also strategically on the offensive in this period, they specialized in this sort of tactics that naturally couldn't be carried out just by the shot. The sense was that, the prejudice among, a bit, this is true, you see, in the Christian or in the Islamic world, the idea is that guns were thought to be dirty. People's stench was like the one of the devil because of sulfur. And so every culture here had this phase of saying, but firearms are basically an instrument of devil and whatever, but they adopted them in the end. There was an important display of Janissary firepower in Hungary in 1440, and this prejudice seems to have collapsed when the Janissaries themselves witnessed firepower in Hungary in 1440-43, and so they began to gradually accept the matchlock arquebus as the most effective weapon, as for the final rank gunner at the time, right? mostly past the era of smaller sort of pistols or something. I mean, there were pistols, of course, but not as the main weapon much anymore. And so from there on, and not necessarily even in a linear way, that you have quite an increase in firepower. Now we have a very interesting list of arms provided, not just by Mihailovich that we have seen here, but by Lascaris. John Lascaris, who was a Greek scholar and diplomat. He was born in 1445 in Constantinople, and he was one of those Byzantine refugees to Italy. In fact, he died in 1535 in Rome. So this guy had fled from the Byzantine Empire to the Papal States, right, the moment of the Ottoman conquest, and he gives us this information that the greater part of the Janissaries, specifically, were armed with only bows and swords, right? Others having bucklers, a sort of spears and pole arms, as we've seen some handguns, some crossbows. Then, of course, you can imagine all the possible panoply here: maces, daggers, axes. Consider that we mostly, and rightfully as Westerners, think of, say, the Western frontiers in Central Europe, in the Mediterranean. But the Ottomans also fought against a great number of enemies that had remained somehow more feudal, more medieval in nature. I mean, if you look at the Ottomans fighting against the Safavid Persians, you would see there essentially a Western modern army at Calderan, let's say, against a feudal Eastern army, right? And so there was a great deal of siege warfare also in the East, and so firepower, yes, was important, but it was important also because in the West there was an increasing one, right? In a also much more sort of systematic way, so that the Ottomans had to adapt constantly and basically to fight on three fronts, and that's what they were so versatile, aside from the fact that the empire was huge, and so they could draw really the most different type of troops, right? But still, the javelin, for example, right? Javeliners did exist, kept existing, even in the Renaissance, etc. But it's obvious that, say, in the Ottoman war, together with archery, this was sort of a more habitual thing. In particular, the Jared javelin, essentially a throwing spear of 1 meter in length, usually with a wooden haft and small steel head, used for hunting as for warfare historically, of Arab origin, was used basically all across the space right during the Renaissance, Northern Africa, Western Asia, Southern Asia, Eastern Europe even. And occasionally several of these jareds were actually carried in a quiver, both on horseback or on foot. So you understand how important, after all, in effect, these weapons really were. I mean, even in very advanced warfare, you see, especially during siege warfare, javelins and stones even being dramatically effective, even in the age of firearms, right? Especially in this earlier era, let's say, not maybe to a head, but they were effective also against armor. We've seen how essentially Janissaries began to take a liking for handguns by the mid-15th century, which also makes sense because they conquered Constantinople shortly after, so that sort of great leap forward in terms of having probably a truly central, I mean, having Constantinople, right? And so taking the place immediately of so much just for having occupied it and having more resources, and through the Janissaries that were this impressive standing army that nobody really had, like a permanent force. Europeans were amazed by this, right? That doesn't make only the quality of a corps or of an army, but, right, in the case of the Janissaries, that was definitely a very high quality indeed, as it embodied the same sultanial power in many ways. We have one contemporary source from the mid-15th century talking of 650 arquebusiers and 50 gunpowder makers among the Janissaries. we have the first census of the Ottoman garrison in the occupied Serbian Novo Brdo in 1455, which counts 10 Janissary handgunners. Right? We're not better informed about the sort of type of weapons, but as we understand, the arquebus was likely the most prevalent. It depends, because again, the Balkans were not provided necessarily with better equipment than same forces in Constantinople. These were just garrisons, but more or less firearms were gradually tending towards the same direction as typologies. There is definitely a great increase in the use of firearms after the defeats that the Ottomans suffered before Selim at a time, say between 1485-91, right at the hands of the Mamluks, really. That is interesting as well, because as we will see, the Mamluks had been developing their own sort of artillery and firearms in general, but to a consistent degree, but never as by the moment of Ottoman takeover that would, even in that case, in fact, at the beginning of the 16th century, present itself by that point as a sort of much more modern and updated, cohesive, and trained force than the Mamluk one that also had been modernizing. Egypt was not Persia, was much more, so like the Ottomans, much more Western historically. But it was still living a bit still with the idea of the Mamluk as in this chivalric, almost feudal mentality, right? And in spite of modernization, things had not been too effective after all, at least against this tumultuous military system that the Ottomans were developing. I mean, we don't have to think that everything was rationalized from the Ottoman side. Right? They had what they had in that desperate struggle that had opposed them to some Western forces, and especially the conquest of the Byzantine Empire. Much was essentially received literally by the latter, and as a consequence, lots of let's say just also Western inputs had filtered in, right? And that's the thing, especially when we look at the Ottoman Mamluk, Ottoman Safavid conflict. We have to keep in mind the Ottomans were dramatically Western compared to Levantine and Middle Eastern powers. Doesn't matter how exotic they look legitimately for Europeans, because they really stayed different, right, from what we had in Western Europe. But there is no doubt that there is a very strong intersection there, and in spite of the differences that did exist even to some stereotypical degree but it's a long story, especially when we talk artillery, because the idea in some manuals is that the Ottomans at some point would have declined because they declined the quality of artillery. It is actually not true. Right? You can make an argument for, of course, the political and social background of the Ottoman Empire being less thriving, less, let's say, technologically productive. But technology is just a spin-off, like, of much else, right? So, the quote I love always to, like, after the Battle of St. Gotthard, the Imperial Field Marshal Raimondo Montecuccoli seized the Ottoman powder depot, and he stated that the powder that at the time was the most important technological measure essentially of artillery development was excellent, right? With that battle, Vienna was saved, right? It gave it another 20 years to prepare defenses for the later siege, but this definitely is the proof, in fact, that the Ottomans were still dangerous and still updated, and yes, they had since the end of the 30 Years' War a lot of European surplus right? When the war had ended, the Westerners didn't know what to do with all those guns, etc. They had lots of contractors in the Ottoman Empire, lots of instructors. Soldiers had to modernize to reform the army. But it's never quite like the story that the Ottomans lost because they had worse firepower than, at least in a strictly technical sense, than the Westerners. The Westerners had a greater firepower by that point, but it was also combined arms tactics, and you can't quite be so categorical about this. I mean, you have to be picturing that, in fact, at a higher level, which is also, again, actually a problem for the Ottomans, but not because of technology. We are fixated as positivists, modernists with technology, but it's actually probably the greatest nonsense of the last 200 years conceptually. In fact, it's a prejudice that spreads dramatically among the masses, unsurprising. But aside from this, this was a bit like today's Janissary is a thing, and we will naturally come back on them at some point, because they are an evergreen in many ways, and still, as you know, with early modern warfare, I began to do, with modern warfare altogether, a bit more in-depth stuff, and especially in the past months. There is a lot to cover, right? Battles, stuff. Usually, I made really lots of videos about early modern warfare, but hardly any battle, right? Because I really treat it in a different way. There are different times, different sources. It starts becoming complicated, but not that I wouldn't do that. There are ways to do it easily, even more easily than with medieval stuff, because in a sense, you need, we are more informed about what actually happened in the battle. So we can't skip even certain sources to understand that, or at least thorough analysis, because sometimes with medieval sources it's like that. You don't even know what happened technically until you reconstruct it. With early modern sources, we can get just a better picture. You can even be more concise about all the sources. Stuff is, with medieval ones, I like to show you the behind the scenes, right? How do we know that? On the basis of what, right? So it really depends. It's always about the method. It's always about the way you use the sources, in fact, and also you use historiography. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.